Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Deadhead Cannabis Show. I'm Larry Mishkin of Mishkin Law in Chicago. I have my co-host Rob Hunt with me today. And Rob, I got to tell you, there's very few things that are as great as going to a Grateful Dead show, mid to late 80s, up into the 90s, and seeing a Jack Straw opener, with Jerry's Fresh coming right onto the stage for the first time all night. Bobby's got a lot of that pent-up energy, and they just really release and let go. And if I'm not mistaken, you were at the show where they played this version of it, so why don't you give us a little information on it?
Yeah, I was. That was a 3-night run at the Oakland-Coliseum celebrating Chinese New Year in January of 1993. And, for anyone that's been to those runs, is depending on the year, either a Mardi Gras run or a Chinese New Year run, both would always have a parade on the actual day of either Fat Tuesday or on the, the Chinese New Year itself. I love the Chinese New Year shows because they had, Dragon Parade going through there. There's a huge Asian community or Chinese community in the Bay Area. So they get tons and tons of people to participate. It was just such I saw 2 Chinese New Years in Oakland. Really, really fun. And, I got to say that Jack Straw openers at that time, it's such a rocker, and it's such a great way to open it, but it doesn't start off as a rocker the way like a Shakedown does or a Bertha does or, some other ones. It kind of leads into, just building up until you hit the part of the show or part of the song that we just listened to, which is blistering licks coming out of Garcia that really set the tone for the night. So, it was the first song I ever saw the Grateful Dead play live, and remains one of my favorites ever since.
Excellent. Well, we will be getting to that show in a little more detail shortly, so please stay tuned for talk on that and other interesting Grateful Dead and musical items we have today. But let's start off on the marijuana side today, Robin. There's a lot going on in the marijuana world, which makes our show easy to do, but stuff that's interesting to talk about. And as we kind of launch here into 2022, the first matter in which I get a lot of questions from people are, where is the market going to expand to? What states are next? Our friends over at MJ Biz have conveniently put out a very good and interesting article, if you're interested in going to take a look at it, that really lays it out on both the medical and the adult use side. And, once again, on both sides, it's great to see a couple of states that you might not otherwise have considered, right? Medical, we've got Kansas in play, Mississippi in play, South Carolina in play, North Carolina maybe, but I always think of North Carolina as being a little more cosmopolitan in the South. But even still, the fact that these states are talking about going medical is incredible. Of course, as we all know, right, Mississippi's been the lone site for the last however many years where the government has its own marijuana farm, and any tests or studies or anything they do, and the ever dwindling number of lucky few who got into the program and get their free joints sent to them by the government periodically. And now Mississippi's going to do it the right way, and be very interesting to see how these states that are primarily composed of what I would say right-leaning and more conservative populations, what we've seen up to this point, Rob, suggests to me that those states should probably pass pretty easily. What do you think?
I think all those states should, but if there's one that's an X factor, it's definitely Mississippi. Anyone that's familiar with Tate Reeves as governor of that state, he's an unpredictable guy. So do I think that it's a foregone conclusion that Tate's going to sign on to the devil's weed? Just because Ole Miss does it from a federal standpoint, that's very much under lock and key and has been for close to 40 years. But for Tate to say we're going to open up a real medical program, I'm not really buying it any more than I did when Nathan Deal came out and said they were going to do something in Georgia, which ended up being walked back completely to a CBD-only law that ultimately had no means of production. So, I'll believe it in Mississippi when I see it. Until then, I think South Carolina, definitely North Carolina, that's not a problem. We'll see about Kansas also. Kansas, pretty conservative, definitely a strong holdout.
Well, Kansas would be significant just for the reason that Kansas and Nebraska have long been known as the either I-70 or I-80, depending on which one you're going through, states of horror for people coming out of Colorado who've gone there for vacation or whatever and happen to have stocked up on a little bit extra to take back east with them. And some of those states have used practices that have already been constitutionally approved by the Supreme Court, where if you take every 10th car randomly and just decide to pull it over and poke your nose around and ask a few questions, you visit any dispensaries while you were there, you pick anything up, you try to bring anything home with you, and they've got a nice little cottage industry going doing that.
Well, that's not it though, Larry. I mean, you know the deal. I mean, first of all, let's be clear about this. They can say it's randomly every 10th car. It's every car with a Colorado license plate. Let's be clear about that. And for a long time, it was cars heading eastbound. And that no longer was the case once they realized the asset forfeiture laws worked in their favor, and they're much better off catching cars going westbound, because going east, all you have to seize is weed. Going west, you've got money.
Right.
So, if you're talking about how to fund these police departments, the major windfall, and here's the outrage, is Kansas and Nebraska then coming back going, oh, well, we've had to actually step up our law enforcement. It's been a great expense to our state, and it's an undue burden for our law enforcement. Nonsense. Colorado weed in the money that's busted coming back across your lines, even if you never even arrest and you just do an asset forfeiture of the cash, it's funded your police departments. And so for those guys to say differently is so disingenuous, because they love the cash that they've been able to seize for the last 15 years coming out of Colorado.
No question about it. No question about it. And yes, maybe I was too nice in giving them the benefit of the doubt in terms of how they determine which cars they want to pull over. But I'm sure that there's any one of a number of factors that you and I could go through and recite that might not make it in a court of law, but doesn't mean that that's not going to be the ultimate and underlying reason why somebody gets pulled over.
Yeah, and you know as well as I do that between the two, a police officer is considered to be a credible witness. So you're going to put someone on the stand and say, well, how did you conduct this investigation? They say, oh, well, we just used the constitutionally approved practice of pulling over every 10th car, and there's no rhyme or reason. Unless someone actually says, well, it seems like this random practice has pulled over 500 cars in a row with a green license plate, Colorado plates and mountains on their plates. Like, is that a coincidence? Oh, yeah, it must be. I'd say about every 10th car is, is Colorado, so it stands to reason. Like, it would take someone actually going in there and doing an investigation and saying, okay, let's see which cars have actually gotten pulled over, and I can all but assure you, based on the stories I've gotten living in Colorado, that it's no doubt targeted to a very specific group.
Yep, but now they're getting ready to at least say join the game, and I'm sure they'll come up with some excuse as to why it's okay to allow the sale, of marijuana. Now it'll be a protectionist policy, right? Well, now we got to do it. We got to protect our young fledgling businesses here in Kansas. We can't have them competing with all that weed from the West.
Here's the thing, too, is you have to think both those states border Missouri now, and Missouri actually has a very robust cannabis industry that's forming. So it's not just a question of it coming east from Colorado now. If you think about the most populous parts of Kansas. Kansas City is actually in Missouri, but right across the border you have Kansas City, Kansas, and you've got Overland Park, Kansas, and then that bleeds into Lawrence, Kansas. That's the major kind of population hub outside of Wichita in that state, and that's all right on the border of Missouri. And Missouri is certainly capitalizing on sending weed across the state. So it's not just diversion from Colorado into Kansas, and that's true of Nebraska as well. I mean, Nebraska borders a handful of other states that have legal cannabis. So again, this we always talk about it in the confines of what does New Jersey legalizing cannabis mean for New York and Pennsylvania? But you forget that it also holds true for what is being bordered on all sides in the Midwest mean for a state that's a holdout, and Kansas eventually they just have to look at as a lost revenue opportunity.
I think you're right, and that's a perfect swing over into looking at what this article has to say about the adult use market when certain states may try to go legal this year. And not surprisingly, there's Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Delaware, all eastern states, and each one of those states has at least one, if not more, states bordering it that does have a program already going right now, maybe even an adult use program once New York actually gets online with what they're doing. But that's in addition to Hawaii and Minnesota and Ohio, typically a red state that has been friendly to marijuana, on certain levels. And it'll be interesting to see what we get here. But I think it's very significant that the majority of these states are east of the Mississippi, and that part of the market is really starting to expand. And I think everybody's going to see Hawaii and scratch their head, because most people probably figure it's been legal in Hawaii for years.
Well, I think most people, if they actually understood the California market, would scratch their head even harder, thinking that California has been legal for years and it's still on a municipal level largely illegal in this state. So wait until you start seeing some of these Midwestern states or Northeastern states have a much more permissive set of laws than even California does. No surprise to me that you're watching a handful, and this is a very broad group of states that MJ Business came out and said, expect to see. But, don't be surprised when all of them go through very, very quickly, and don't be surprised when they've got relatively permissive rules attached to them. So if this list that we're looking at, Larry, goes through, then the feds they've got no choice but to act when you've got major population hubs such as Pennsylvania, Ohio, going through on top of New York and New Jersey and a couple other major California. It's at that point it's done. I don't care who's in control of the Senate. I don't care who's in control of the presidency. it's too much at that point when you've got that many Americans with access to adult use legal cannabis.
And again, you're absolutely right, Rob. I agree with everything you just said, and I just think it's important, in our hyper-partisan state that the country is in right now, this is the topic that unites everybody. And there's just as many red states as blue states that are getting ready to make this shift. And even though we've seen a pushback from a certain number of Republican governors who have not been happy with the fact that their state actually got a program passed and they want to try and push back on it, South Dakota being the most notorious at the moment, but that's just because of who the governor is. But this is great. What else? You never hear Tucker Carlson railing about it. You never hear Rachel Maddow railing about it.
Well, for the record, I never hear Tucker Carlson railing about anything, because I'd never turn the guy on. So let's be clear that I will never listen to a word that comes out of that guy's mouth, because it's such nonsense. But having said that, on a partisan basis, Maddow certainly is a relatively partisan actor as well, and you're right about that.
So there's such wonderful unity around it, and unfortunately it's still so ostracized by so many people that no politician will be broad-minded enough or forward-thinking enough to adopt it as a way to reunite the country. Let's just all get together, be great marijuana manufacturers, make a lot of money for everybody, and get a good buzz on.
Amen. Pretty easy to do. It shouldn't be too difficult to implement.
A couple of Grateful Dead nerds like you and I can think it up or talk about it. Certainly, the powers that be can figure it out too.
Dude, I put this together in the parking lot of 88.
You know what? And I don't doubt that for a minute. I'm sure you did. I'm sure, while the rest of us were walking around trying to figure out where we were going to get our mushrooms from, you were like putting together plans.
Well, this is things that you conceive on nitrous oxide late in the evening. You come up with all sorts of brilliant ideas once the Wawas wear off.
That's what I've heard. But as everybody rushes, to open these markets, there's lessons out there that I think everybody need to pay attention to. And as we return to our second story, Robert, I'm going to turn to you because this is more up your alley. But right now we have analysts who are cutting hundreds of millions of dollars from Tilray, Canopy, and Aurora marijuana sale forecasts. I know we touched on this from a different angle last week, and maybe you can pick it up from there and let us know what it all means.
Yeah, I'll expand on what I said last week, which is that, I had no way not to say this offensively, but most analysts in the cannabis, or most analysts covering the cannabis industry, fundamentally don't understand the market they're covering. They take the approach of, as I said last week, if you build it, they will come, and that only is true if you have a total addressable market that can actually, sustain the purchasing of whatever's produced. And in the case of the Canadian market, it hasn't borne out. They overbuilt, they overspent, they did everything wrong, and the analysts bought into it for a long time, and they're finally coming off the sugar high that they had for 3 years to say, oh, wait, okay, we're not going to sell that much weed, and finally, we're starting to hear from the companies that there's no way they're going to hit their targets, so we've got to revise our earnings forecast, we've got to revise our revenue forecasts, and it's bringing these guys back down to earth, which, again, is, kind of why we touched on Tilray last week, making purchases outside of the cannabis industry, and we're watching other groups do that as well. If they've got the capital sitting on their balance sheet and they know they're not going to make their money with acquisitions or expansion in cannabis, where are they going to put that money to work that actually is going to be profitable for that business? And very likely, a lot of these groups are going to find ways to expand out of the industry to become conglomerates that are more similar to like a Nabisco or a Unilever.
Look, these are all good points, and as I read through this article again from our friends at MJ Biz, it's just fascinating to me because there's just so much in here what you say, talking about other names that are probably recognizable for those who are involved in the investment banking industry, and people who are still sitting here would almost seem to me to be pie in the sky numbers, with the hopes and ideas of where this market is going to go. And I suppose at the end of the day it would be wonderful if they're right. I just always worry about the potential impact if you get enough investors who invest enough money based on some of these analysts' reports that turn out not to be accurate, and then people start losing money. Does that ultimately make it more difficult for the smaller guys in the industry to be able to find outside money?
Yeah, the simple answer is absolutely. And that's what we saw happen in 2019, where for the first 2 quarters of the year, capital is relatively easy to come by. But once the Canadian market crashed its first real crash, then essentially the adage of rising tides float all boats, a lowering tide sinks all ships, right? So it's there was a case of anyone that was underwater in their portfolio as a result of having these inflated beliefs of what the Canadian market was going to do. When the shine came off that one, or the smell came off the rose, or whatever analogy you want to use, then you saw people saying, okay, well, I'm no longer going to invest in cannabis because this dream is obviously not what it was cracked out to be, without ever really objectively thinking about it and going, okay, well, do I think there's a California company that should theoretically be larger than Canopy Growth or larger than Aurora? The answer is, if you believe in the size of the market and you look total addressable market to total addressable market, California should be a more interesting market, simply because you can do a wholesale roll up in that state where there are no barriers outside of municipal changes. Whereas in Canada, you're still dealing with provincial governments acting as middlemen between the buyer and the seller. So there is no vertically integrated market that's seamless the way there is in California. So it's this idea that the Canadian market was so exciting based on federal legality. Okay, well, in California, you've got state legality without any federal intervention under the Gavin Newsom government. That should be just as exciting, and it's not. And the reason it's not is because people are smart enough to look at California and say that's not a $10 billion market cap business in that market. I don't know why they thought differently of Canada.
Okay, but it's interesting that one of the companies they mentioned in here is Tilray, because sliding right along, another story we were looking at, and we just talked about this last week. Tilray's venture outside of straight cannabis and into the alcoholic beverage industry. And then just a day or two now, another article drops showing that Tilray and AB InBev have announced that their partnership or merger that they had been contemplating is now off the table. What do you make of that?
It's not surprising to me at all. It's when you think that Tilray right now is making their own moves and they're buying Sweetwater and they're buying Breckenridge Distillery and they're buying other microbreweries. Ultimately, do they really need a $50 million co-partnership with AB InBev on a drink manufacturer in the cannabis space? The answer is no. They already have the means of production to make whatever they want between their distiller and their brewers. They can enter multiple markets, doing it that way. So is there any utility left in an association with AB InBev? I would say that was a decision that was probably driven, and I don't know this for sure, and if I did, I certainly couldn't reveal. But I think that's a decision that would have been driven from the C-suite of Tilray, not from AB InBev.
That's very interesting. In the article, then again at the end, they throw in a little graph, at least for Canadian sales, that shows that of all the various ways in which people in Canada can purchase THC, that beverages is second from the bottom. That it only accounts for 2% of sales of cannabis products, only just slightly ahead of topicals. Although it does, they say, represent an increase of 3%, but still, and I guess this isn't surprising, and it always makes me happy, nice to see that according to these statistics, that flower is still the leader in sales at 47%, and is almost double the next one in line, which is pre-rolls, which of course is just another version of flower for people that are too lazy to roll their own joints. So, that comprises between the two of them almost a 70% of the market share for Canada. And I hope that means that we're going to have some good flower still being grown for a long time, and everybody's not immediately running out to extracts and edibles and all of that kind of stuff.
Well, a newsflash for anyone out there. Flower is and will be for a long time king. And for all you people that think that other form factors are going to continue to chip away at market share, I hear it every year. And every year the numbers come back roughly the same. So it's, until social consumption happens, nobody cares about beverage. They really don't. I mean, it's great that there's some really good beverage products out there in the market. It's good that, people are starting to do really low dose, 2.5 milligram THC versions of beverages. But if you don't have a place where you can sit around and hang out with your buddies and consume it in a public setting, that's not the form factor you're going to use. And nobody I know would ever consider okay, let's crack a beverage and share it. It doesn't have the same appeal as smoking a joint or of packing a bowl or packing bong hits. It just doesn't exist. Flower's king. Flower's going to remain king. There's no terpene profile involved in a beverage. There's nothing else that really separates it. There's no bag appeal. All the things that really make cannabis interesting do not exist in a beverage.
I also see it, as since you are ingesting it like you would any other food product. I see it as an offshoot of edibles. I also see it as the easiest of all edibles to abuse, because it's easy if you start drinking to just keep drinking without really stopping to think about how much you're drinking. If you buy a chocolate bar that's broken up into 10 pieces, at least you have to stop and break off each piece before you put it in your mouth. But with the beverage, you can just sit there if you're thirsty, and before you know it, you've knocked back a bottle, which for somebody who's not expecting something that strong could really be a pretty potent buzz.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's start slow and or start low and go slow adage definitely holds true, and that's why I think for beverages to be successful, they have to be low THC, because if they're not, it's like you don't pound Everclear. There's no way that you want a 20 milligram or 30 milligram cannabis beverage where all of a sudden you drink one, don't feel anything, you drink another, and the next thing you know you're way higher than you'd like to be. You put 2.5 milligrams in each beverage, and you sit there and hang out with your buddies and drink 3 or 4 or 5 of them, you're probably fine. You probably have a really nice buzz going, and that's the intended effect of the same way you'd have 3 or 4 beers going to the bar. But that's the future of beverages, and then it's going to come down to taste. But again, until you actually have a place to consume, nobody cares.
Right, that's very true. And let me ask you this: do you see a future with beverages that have both alcohol and THC in them?
I mean, in my future, yeah, it's, absolutely. If I could have a 2 milligram, 8% alcohol by volume beverage, I'd be all about it. I'd drink 2 of those in a night and call it a day. Do I think that the government's going to allow for that? Probably not. I mean, it's again, you're sticking a finger in a dike of the inevitable, right? So I can buy a 6-pack here, and I can buy a cannabis beverage there, and I can sit at my house and alternate between the two, but I can't actually mix them together. Give me one credible reason why not, because everybody's going to be doing it anyway, or everybody that consumes both cannabis and alcohol. And there's lots of people that only do one or the other. But for anyone that uses both, I can't think of a time I've been at a party where people are smoking weed there isn't drinking going on as well. So it's relatively ridiculous not to be able to have the two form factors combined, unless like the 2 regulatory departments that handle each can't get their act together to have some sort of cross-pollination as far as policy.
Well, but that's, in our world, as we all know, it's that little group that, controls everything. If you can't get them to agree on something, then it's all just talk. So, it just fascinates me to see where it's at and where it's going to go, and where it might wind up. And, I just wonder then if, you want to have, bourbon with THC, does it still have to be made in Kentucky and get the THC down there, in order to keep it kosher, as it were, or champagne, right? THC champagne. I guess we'll find out. Somebody's going to be creative enough.
A Bordeaux by any other name.
Bordeaux by, that's right. It's going to be a whole new world for sommeliers. So always tons of fascinating and interesting stories. Again, thanks to MJ Biz for being such a great provider of news information for us. But we're going to turn to music now. And before we dive back into this song, this concert that we're going to get to talk about in a minute, and it's always fun when we have a concert that either Rob or I or both of us managed to be at, and he was at this one. So we kind of get the insider's view on things, which is really nice. We do have to take just a moment and give a quick shout out to yet another musical legend that we've lost, and another woman who not only was a musical legend in her own right, but in a only Grateful Dead kind of way, had a real impact on the Grateful Dead and Deadheads. The woman is Rosa Lee Hawkins. She was one of the original members of the Dixie Cups, a group of 3 black women who started recording in the early 1960s and had a big hit with Chapel of Love and a couple of other tunes, and ultimately recorded Iko Iko, which was a tune that had been written, more or less, as near as anyone can seem to tell, by James Crawford, whose version dated back to the 1920s.
Which was called Giacomo, wasn't it? It wasn't called Iko.
Correct. It was called Giacomo. But somehow at the end of the day, the Dixie Cups and James Crawford's representatives all negotiated, and the Dixie Cups wind up getting some sort of credit for the writing of the song. But they recorded it in 1965, and it's a great studio version with great harmonies, and they've got great voices, and they really infuse a lot of Southern soul and style into it, and it's a great tune. What I love about it doesn't really sound very much at all like the version we're used to hearing the Grateful Dead sing, but of course neither Bonnie Dobson's Morning Dew, compared to the version that Jerry plays. So I guess the Dead will always have a little bit of artistic license with these things, but nevertheless, a tune that was eventually covered by Dr. John and a whole host of great rockers and Southern musicians. But hats off and thoughts with Rosalie Hawkins and her family. The other two members of the band, I believe, are still alive. Unfortunately, I don't have their names off the top of my head. One of them is Rosalie's sister, and the other one is her cousin. Again, condolences to the family. The loss of another musical legend. If you go to YouTube, you can find clips of it, and it's worth checking out.
And it should be noted, those guys started that band, I think, when they were like 14 or 15 years old. I think they had that hit before they were 18. So, the fact that they actually came up with something that's kind of as timeless as Iko is, and still to this day, when you think about sort of the Creole tradition of Mardi Gras, and the different bands of Indian tribes that they were making reference to, their version is such a fun, playful sing-song version, which is so much different, as you said, than what the Grateful Dead's approach was on it. But, I love the lyrics to that song, and I love the fact that lyrics don't have to remain the same. They can change every single time they sing them, as long as the theme is the same, which is basically, I'm sending my guys out to check out your guys before the, to gather information and find out what we can find to try to win this competition of, who's the best costumed, who's the best tribe. It's a really, fun, playful song about, I'm better than you.
I think that's right, and it is just one of those songs that's always fun to hear whenever the band would choose to play it and get on with it, and I always loved it. In fact, my second show ever, which was out in Syracuse in 1982, and they came out of the space into an Iko, which to this day is probably my highest Grateful Dead moment of all time, when all of a sudden there I was, off in another universe already, and the Grateful Dead came out of space into this tune that my buddies had been telling me about. Yeah, they don't play it very often, but maybe, and there it was. And boy, you talk about, if there's a moment where I got on the bus, baby, that was it. Neil was like, hands out for the fare. I'm like, I'm in. I'm all in. Whatever it takes, let me in. Here, I was just going to say one other thing. It is a great tune, Iko, and everybody covers it, and you really love it. However, the one that I heard, I will tell you that there's one version of it that just never worked for me. And that was when my kids were young, my older ones, so back in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, and they were getting into whatever all the kiddie pop was back at that particular point in time. And one of the hotter acts was a youngster who I believe is still around doing music, named Aaron Carter. And Aaron Carter, on one of his albums that my kids loved,
don't diss Aaron Carter. Come on, man.
Put out a version of Iko Iko, and they thought it was the greatest. And I immediately took them downstairs, and put on one of any 5 versions of it that I had lying around at the house at the moment. And I said, "Listen to this. Forget you heard that. And hey, Aaron Carter may be the greatest guy in the world, but that version of Iko Iko did not work for me." But otherwise, it's hard to find a version of it that just doesn't work for you on a certain level. It's and you're right. The beauty of it is the words can be whatever you want them to be.
Yeah. If you want a great version, I think the one that everyone points to is July 7th, 1989 from JFK in Philly. And that version is just, if you want, Garcia's playful best, it's as good as it gets.
Yeah, that is a good one. And then the one I also like is the one they played in front of the pyramids in 1978, which is a much slower version of it with, kind of spacey, taking into account their surroundings and whatever other spirits might be in the air that night. But it's a song that could do that, and it was always great to hear. And Jerry always was very, having a good time when he sang it. You could always tell, especially when he'd, really get down to some of those good hard Creole lyrics, that instead of just some of the more standard ones that he always sang.
And once again, I think between that and between Man Smart, Women Smarter, it introduced me as a listener to so many different styles of music that I probably wouldn't have otherwise known. I've already credited the Grateful Dead for having me learn a lot of the old country artists, whether it's Johnny Cash or Merle Haggard or Marty Robbins. When it comes to the Creole guys, I would have I would have figured out who Dr. John was over time. I would have learned Harry Belafonte over time. But it certainly accelerated my love of music that I would have otherwise not known about until I probably went to New Orleans for the first time.
Well, you're right, and I could probably go through almost every single rock group in my collection of CDs at home, maybe with the exception of like the Who and Jimi Hendrix and the Rolling Stones, who I got to know about or appreciate more, such as the Beatles and Bob Dylan, just by hearing the Grateful Dead cover their music, and that was always a great way to do it. But I chuckled when you mentioned women.
Or you could just listen to Nicky Hopkins and Billy Preston. In between those two, they played with every single musician you just you just brought up.
That's true. That's true. But you made me laugh when you mentioned Women Are Smarter because for my friends and I who really loved Iko, and Women Are Smarter is fine. But it's a very, very similar sounding song, and one of the when I was first hearing them, it was hard for me initially to distinguish which one it was. So we'd always hold our breath, hoping that it was Iko, and if it was women, we'd say fine, and we'd all play along with it. But some point I learned to make that distinction. But Women Are Smarter was always fun, and Bobby always played it to the hilt. So
I only distinguished it normally between where it was in the set. If it was opening a set, it was 9 times out of 10 an Iko. If it was second or third song, 9 times out of 10 was women. But other than that, if you were to put the two songs in front of me, I've got as much chance of figuring that out as being able to tell you what the rule against perpetuties is.
Yeah, please don't give me a headache. For those of you who have been to law school, you don't understand. For those of you who have, you're welcome.
There's a couple songs like that. Though. It's a question of was Cumberland going to be Cumberland, or was it going to be two other songs that sounded almost identical coming out of it. So, there's a handful of them where okay, I can't distinguish during the intro what this is going to be. But Iko is obviously Iko Women Are Smarter is definitely the most obvious example of it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think that there was a part of that Jerry did intentionally, just gave him more flexibility. He could just play off to one or the other at the last minute without really breaking stride too much or, changing up the beat. So, whatever, unfortunately he's not here for us to ask him, but if he were, we certainly would, and hopefully be able to get some kind of an answer. But let's move on, man. Let's start talking about this Chinese New Year show in 1993. I only was lucky enough to see one run of Chinese New Year shows, and that was back in 87. And I flew out to the West Coast to see my buddy Tommy and to go catch a couple of shows in the San Francisco Civic Center, which I guess is now the Bill Graham Center. They were great fun. There was just a lot of fun. At that point, I had been to a few New Year's shows already, and obviously wasn't the same, but it did have a lot of the same celebratory feel. And to see the Chinese dragon dancing and everything, and the extended drum solo that would accompany it was really, really cool. So Chinese New Year shows are always really fun for me. But 1993, is kind of a complicated year, right? That's still, well within the framework before Jerry's going to go 2 years, and at this point in this show, 2.5 years later. But it is kind of, much farther down the road and entering this era where, you would go to a show and you weren't always quite sure what you were going to get. And some nights you might get a show like this, which had a 6-song first set, which, always left me a little bit sad. And not that they would really shortchange you on the music so much, but, I was always a big fan of the 7 or 8 or 9 song first set, really give you a little variety and keep you going and everything. But somehow, as you go through all of this show, and Rob, again, you can talk on this better than I, they always wind up doing things that make you glad you're there.
Yeah, without a doubt. I'd say on the 3-night run on this one, as you said, 93 was kind of a weird year, especially the opening of it, because in the spring of 92, the first shows of the year introduced, 4 or 5 new tunes. That's when So Many Roads came out, and Karina, and, Victim, or not Victim, a handful of new songs came out in 92. And then 94, the first couple shows on the West Coast, also introduced a handful of new songs. 93 didn't. 93, these were the first shows of the year. It was coming off of, no New Year's run that year. And, you kind of had high expectations when you came in. You're like, okay, it's nothing too exciting. But there were some pretty good highlights that came out of this run. Obviously, I'd say the big one was that Carlos Santana came out on the third night, which was, I believe, a Tuesday night. It was a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday run. And Carlos played, 4 or 5 songs in the second set and into the encore with him, including a Gloria encore, which is, relatively rare. And having, Carlos and Garcia do it is always pretty exciting. So, different Chinese New Year runs, you always knew you were going to get something special. In 91, they had the Chinese Symphony Orchestra come out and play with them. So you could almost always expect some sort of a guest, coming out for those shows. But it was a question of what else was going to come with that. But this run, I started us off with the Jackstraw opener of all 3 nights. And, they came into it starting pretty hot if you listen to the licks that we played in the intro. But, maybe we should listen to some of the other exciting parts, which is on the third night. Carlos sitting in and trading licks with Jerry during Stella Blue is something you don't hear too often, and there aren't too many people that get to say that they've gotten to sit on stage and play Stella. I mean, it's like Steve Miller playing Morning Dew in Vegas with Jerry was another rare one that you very rarely get the ballads that are played because he doesn't really want to give those up. But Carlos did a really nice job on his interpretation of Stella, and I don't know if Dan's got a clip of that we can listen to for a second.
Saying that this is a hallmark of the Deadhead Cannabis Show. We're not going to tease you about a great musical moment and not give you a taste of it. So, if we're going to talk, you're going to get to hear it. And, hearing that makes me think of this. Before Jerry Garcia, before I became really aware of Jerry and his music, probably the single guitarist, who had the biggest impact on me and, whose sound drew me to the music the most was Carlos Santana. And, I loved The Who at that point, and I loved the Rolling Stones at that point, but I didn't ever think of Pete Townsend or Keith Richards being a guitar player in the mold of Santana, who in fact was, back in those early albums, probably as close to, jamming out like the Grateful Dead as anybody else was. And it was just such a pleasure to listen to him, see him in concert a few times, and really just get to hear him take off. And, the idea that Carlos is up on stage with Jerry, who between the two of them are probably the two most distinctive sounding guitar players, that I listen to, is just, it's either you're on the bus or you're not, man. Either you're there that night or you're not. But if you are, it's a great place to be.
Yeah, for sure. And I got to see Carlos play with the Dead a few times. But this is the only time where I got to see him sit in for 4 or 5 songs, sort of the same manner that I got to see, Branford play with the Grateful Dead. And anytime I got to see that collaboration is fantastic. And I'll tell you, for the viewers out there, or the listeners out there that have a chance, if you really want to see Jerry and Carlos get it on, find the YouTube version of them playing the song Get Uppa from August 2nd, 1989 from Los Angeles' Biltmore Bowl. But that's one, if you want to see pure trading of licks back and forth between these two guys in a setting where it's really just Carlos and Jerry, there's no better way to kind of get the full taste of it. But I'll tell you that, the second best thing I can think of is probably this January 26, 1993 show from Oakland, where you get a full taste of it for multiple songs at the end of the second set.
And what's amazing to me is, number one, we all think of the Grateful Dead and the way they play their music and how it's, it's as perfect, and yet then we see that a guy like Carlos, or you mentioned Steve Miller, I was at those Las Vegas shows as well, and they both really fit in almost seamlessly. As if they've been doing it their whole lives. And in fact, Miller did play quite a bit with the Grateful Dead in the early days, and Carlos and Jerry have played a number of times. And I love the way that it enhances the song, right? It's not even so much that you get less of Jerry. It's like, wow, you get more of this other good stuff. And it really gives us an opportunity to truly appreciate just how good Jerry can be when he's playing the background guitar for somebody like that, right? He almost becomes the Bob Weir for a minute. Carlos takes over, but Jerry's still back there noodling a little bit, filling in the holes just right. And it's really, I think it's a great listen and great call today. Yeah,
and it wasn't just the Stella. I think he sat in and played the other one, Stella, Lovelight, and then the Gloria. So as I said, there's a lot to listen to there for people that are Santana fans. Certainly worth checking out.
Okay. Well, that's great. And as always, of course, any show that we're talking about, if we're taking the time to talk about it, that's as close to a recommendation, for you to go find a way to listen to it as we can give you. And the beauty of it is you will listen to it and, you will hear stuff that we didn't talk about, stuff maybe that we've missed. And that's always the beauty of this. You can go back and listen to the same show over 5 times, and all of a sudden, you hear something in the Birdsong or the Knocking on Heaven's Door, where you're like, where did that come from? Why haven't I heard that before? And then, going forward from that point, you can't miss it. And this is a great show. It's a great example of the Grateful Dead during that period of time in their career.
And it's also the rare time where Women Are Smarter opened a second set, completely destroying what I said earlier, that 9 times out of 10 it's going to be an Iko. In this case, it was a women.
Well, there you go. Just to keep you honest, man, right? That's the way it always has to be. Otherwise, just when we think we have them figured out, they surprise you with something. So, to this day. So that's all good too. But I just want to really quickly point out to people that we always try to find shows as best we can that were played on the date that our podcast drops. So this one's dropping on the 24th. So we're talking about January 24th, 93. There's a lot of good shows on that day. When I go back and I start looking around, you have the middle of the historic 1969 Avalon Ballroom run where they pulled some of the material for Live Dead. We have part of a run at the Honolulu Civic Center in 1970 that a run that got great reviews, and some say introduced Bill to the Hawaiian lifestyle that he went on to adopt and move into. 1971, and this is really a favorite of mine now that I started listening to it, a show at the Seattle Center Arena. And one of the good things about that show is it's one of the shows, it may be the last show they play right before they slide into Portchester for the 6-show run at the end of February that we've talked about. And as a result, that would make this the second to last show with Mickey Hart in the band before he takes his 3 or 4 year break. And in the notes of this show, they do in fact mention that this show from January 24th, 71 in Seattle is the last live duet drum solo that Mickey and Billy play until October 24th, 1974. So if you were there that night, you really got in on some good stuff that wasn't going to be repeated for a while. But again, that's the beauty of the Dead. Either you're there that night or you're not. But January 24th certainly seems to be a strong night in Grateful Dead history, and the 93 show is no exception.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when we made the decision of which one to talk about, obviously our decision was prejudiced by the fact that I was at one and none of us were at the other. And the other part of it is that it is just about to be Chinese New Year again, which I think this year falls on either February 1st or 2nd this year. And it's just a good excuse to say to our audience, Gong Hei Fat Choi, which I believe is a terrible way to murder the Cantonese language to say Happy New Year in Chinese.
And Rob, I just am praying to God that what you actually said was Happy New Year in Chinese and not some other clause you might have learned along the way from your friends who taught you Cantonese.
Yeah, no, I assure you that might be the only Cantonese I know, so that's as good as I get, and I tried to verify before I went on, before I said something that's offending millions in other areas.
Potentially billions.
Well, billions, except they can't hear anything we say, and it's all censored, so yeah, I think it might make it as far as Taiwan. That's, as far as we have to check our analytics now and see who's listening from the other side of the pond. But I will say, Chinese New Year, I got to see it twice, two things, both times really looked forward to it. Simply because of the pageantry, simply because of, especially in the Bay Area, which is a great place to do it. I think New York or San Francisco are really the only places that really make sense to do a Chinese New Year celebration for the Grateful Dead. It was just so much fun, and I'm a huge fan of just the celebration of Chinese New Year in general. So to all of our Chinese listeners out there, have a very happy New Year. That makes an easy decision for us to pick a show that corresponds with it.
Absolutely. When you think back about it, for the casual deadhead, that was a really magical time to be in California, right? You'd have the New Year's shows, then you'd roll into the Chinese New Year shows, and then you'd roll into the Mardi Gras shows. And although they might do a little bit of traveling, in between or here and there, those were always, pretty much on the schedule shows that you could count on right around the same time every year and make a whole pilgrimage of it.
Yeah. I mean, like the way you could expect, a handful of shows in the Northeast in September. You could almost be guaranteed at least 6 nights in New York City. You were pretty much guaranteed that December, January, and early February were reserved for the Bay Area, almost exclusively. And as I said, that was the time where, if they're going to release new material, almost like clockwork, you could expect that, there's going to be new stuff that was being dropped at those shows, because that was one of the only times where they had large blocks of time off where they could actually get together and hang out and practice. Going into either the Chinese New Year or the Mardi Gras. So if you look at, when new stuff was dropped, it was usually in those West Coast shows before they brought them on the spring tour on the East Coast, starting usually in early March. But the debuts would be Bay Area debuts.
Well, in fact, in Jim's last show, he and I talked about the 1984 New Year's show, which was my first, where on one of the lead-up shows, I don't remember which one, they dropped Day Tripper. Which everybody had been running around talking about forever and waiting to hear, and they finally played it. And then New Year's Eve in the third set, they broke out Gimme Some Lovin' was just absolutely amazing, and everybody walked out of there that night, singing the fill beat, boo doo 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 doo, boom, doo 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 doo, boom. And it just, I remember sitting there as they're playing it, and my buddy was like, "Isn't this great?" And every time Phil hit the string, it was like the whole room just started shaking. It was awesome. It was just great.
Yeah, both great covers. And I can tell you, Day Tripper, I don't think there's too many songs that Garcia played, albeit only briefly, that he was so animated, especially when he kind of went into the bow, da 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 da. And I'd say the one I love, and there's a video of it, is from June 25th, 1985, from the Blossom Music Center in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. Jerry's definitely very animated.
He is, when he finds a tune he likes, he'll let you know, and that's great. Yeah, it was funny because we'd been all, still young in my Deadhead career, and people were talking about, they're going to play Day Tripper, they're going to play Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and they did play Day Tripper, and a few years later they did eventually get around to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and maybe we'll find a good version of that one day and play it. That's a little bit trickier because some nights Garcia was really flat on that, and when he was, it wasn't necessarily the most exciting tune to listen to. But
as we realized trying to pick a show a few weeks ago, we vetoed it based on the Lucy in the Sky. Oh, that's great.
Exactly.
Well, I can tell you that I think we picked a nice one. It's hard to find shows in '93 that get the sort of same appeal that people expect to have from like an '85 show or from a '77 show or sort of different eras. But there are some gems from the '90s, and as I'm a product of the '90s or late '80s, early '90s, there's plenty of stuff that I saw that I walked away as happy as anyone else that left that arena. And as we said before, that was really mid-career. That wasn't the end. That was the middle for these guys. So. With that, maybe we should talk about what we've got coming up. Before we break today, I did want to send a shout out to our good friend David Gans and wish him a very speedy recovery. He's been suffering with COVID for the last couple days, and he's been trying to get some tweets out to let people know, kind of the state of how he's doing. But he appears to be on the mend. But from all of us over here, get well soon, Dave, and thanks for all you do.
Absolutely, and when I was listening to his show the other day with Gary and only Gary was on, I just assumed that at the time David was out traveling or getting ready to perform somewhere or maybe performing already, and only just heard myself about his COVID. So absolutely anybody, of course, and certainly, David is such an important member of the Dead community and was kind enough to be on our show that he has all of our support, and we will look forward to hearing him back in his normal place with Gary on Sunday afternoon. So thank you for mentioning that. I think that what I'm going to do at this point is hand it off to Rob, and he's going to take you guys home and introduce the final closing clip of the day. But thank you all once again for listening. As always, we'll look forward to talking to you again next week and have lots of great things to be talking about then. So in the meantime, be safe, enjoy, and most importantly, enjoy your cannabis responsibly. Rob?
Thanks, Larry. Lots of fun again today. And I think appropriately as it's getting to be late afternoon in California, I will leave you with the sun setting here in western skies with the end of the first night of January 24th, 1993 from the Oakland Coliseum with really good, clean Garcia licks on the Knockin' on Heaven's Door encore. So with that, we'll see you next week. Looking forward to lots of fun shows coming up, and signing off here from California.
I won't shed them anymore. Sun is setting in western sky. People, I believe I must be knocking on heaven's door. Heaven's door.